So back to the patterns of digital strategy. As a quick reminder, this is strategy in a tech knowledge age. This is changing the world of strategy, which is still about anticipation. I know that is not changing, but how does strategy adjust to emerging trends? How it reads better the landscape, and how we build more agile and adaptive organizations through that. Also recognizing that many strategy practices and tools being used in organizations um, date from the 60s and the 80s, or around those areas, and predate digital. So, it's time to refresh also the tooling, the approaches, to be better fit for the knowledge work. And we believe that Wardley Maps is actually a more modern framework, and that's why we are demonstrating its use with what we're talking about here. So as I said, today the March session is about adjacent moves. And in October, November, we're looking at vertical integration and matching the inside out and outside in. Other sessions coming in April are about consolidating utilities, which is a sort of development from today's session. And then looking at how do we see the advantage of creating intelligence from data, aligning value chains, and creating organization that flow, creating ecosystems, and we'll have a look at banking as well. So for December, we're looking for a suggestion. If you have one, please let us know. And as a reminder, those sessions tend to be relatively tutorial style, which allows you to relax during your lunchtime. We mark some pauses through those sessions for your participation. Some feedback was it would be nice to be able to engage a bit. And we're looking to stimulate your reflections at 2 points. One is about those use cases, and not absolute convenience today, but adjacent moves, and how a Wardley map can also help you capture better perspective for better decisions. And we'll do more sessions probably around training. So if you were interested to train to Wardley maps, and we might put together a cohort or do a cohort on strategy as well, and that would be something we could do. But please let us know as we're trying to gauge interest for those things. So to get us started, what is an adjacent move? And if we start, and those more or more about the framework of Wardley maps, defining basically the curve, the cumulative curve of adoption of something. And at the start, the genesis, some new concept, new things, new ideas are not necessarily widely adopted. And through the maturity of that idea becoming something that we can custom design for a customer, or becoming a product for many customers, or becoming something that is a commodity, something that is more and widely available. You have the rate of adoption going up to 100% of its addressable audience when something is really a commodity. Everybody consumes it in some shape or form. And you have a maturity of adoption, a maturity of the product, and those go hand in hand. And the maps actually map on some cartography. They map basically this evolution. Now, another fundamental concept in maps is that a curve of adoption will get to 100% of adoption of its addressable audience, but may be followed by additional curves. And over time, some things may change, and the adoption will ramp up, but with a different technology, a different paradigm in developing the audience. And a good way of understanding that is if we think about the mobile phone. Initially, it was very much the radio phone and analog at that. And it reached an audience of professional, which had the big brick phones and so on. And that had a special use in their business for that. And then came the GSM, which initially was in its infancy. The range was much smaller, so you needed a lot more mast to operate GSM. And that was essentially for cities at the start. And then it became, it developed and the phones became smaller and smaller, with Nokia being the sort of apex incumbent on that. And the overall adoption of mobile phones grew because it was no longer a very specialized product, very expensive as a radio phone. It was much more accessible and the coverage was growing. And at the start of mobiles, the coverage was actually a critical thing. You would go on a network that had the most coverage. Then became, RIM and BlackBerry, which was probably a little bit more professional, not as widespread, but the concepts were actually a new curve in itself, which developed, and then came the smartphones. And right now, with the smartphone, the adoption is pretty much everybody pretty much has a mobile phone, being an iPhone or an Android most of the time. So here we see multiple technology paradigms, multiple curves for a service that has grown in its scope, from placing phone calls to accessing the internet and having apps and so on. So the curve have defined different paradigms, and overall the adoption has grown. So if we look at that on a map, and actually, sorry, for the first also idea is the Flexus curve by Kinevin. And this idea emerges from crossing the chasm. So very much looking at this pivot point or inflection points where the transition from a curve to another is going to happen. And typically what you have is the new technology as new players. And for those players, it's very difficult to displace the old use and make the new use more relevant. And it's very much documented in the book Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore. And that's a difficulty for the green line of the incumbent, finding how they go from beta to gamma points, or omega points, sorry, looking to create adoption of the new technology. And equally, the red line is the incumbent who benefit from having scale on their existing curve of adoption and starting to get market growth on it, and basically starting to have a very healthy return. But if they don't watch the new technology and don't adapt to it, at some point becomes a point of basically, I think Dave Snowden calls it complacency-induced failure. So they were on the technology, they're not adapting to the new one, they're actually milking what they had, and eventually they fall into irrelevance because the new technology is taking over. And that's very much those points of inflection when a new curve is actually meeting an old curve. And that's why every single time pretty much the apex incumbent find itself dislodged. So it's useful to remember those ideas of disruption because the adjacent move, or either to prevent that disruption or actually create that disruption. And that's what we're going to look at in the next hour, is around how do we notice that within a business and how a business challenges itself to explore adjacent moves. and how a business might be disrupted by adjacent move and how they need to watch the market for what may be coming. So quick question so far, and since we're only a few people in today, do you recognize this pattern of adjacent move and those inflection points? And is there any companies or any stories that come to mind for you? And please feel free to say so on audio, or you can put it in the chat as well. Any sort of companies that come to mind with these adjacent move and inflection points? Dave Snowden talks very much about IBM, which was very familiar to him, where IBM was, the big machines and so on, and Microsoft came along and did the software, and IBM did not see that they were actually offering leverage for Microsoft by creating the personal computer. So Microsoft got that leverage, and once Microsoft emerged from that, then IBM was really left on the machines. And then, of course, there was multiple machines that could use their software. Any other examples you may have that come to mind? Okay, I'll leave it at that. But just think about how new things, and if we talk about, Nokia was a great example of it. If we talk about Netflix and versus the blockbusters like companies, those are the ideas of inflection points and transition from one curve to another, where the technology is actually shifting the paradigm and shifting the use. And with maps, we can actually look to spot that. So that's what we'll explore today. So how does that look on a map? And I won't go through the whole explanation about our Wardley maps, and the previous sessions had a little crash course. Since some people are becoming more familiar with it, I don't expand too much on that today. But if we imagine the genesis and the evolution from left to right, genesis is about inventing something new, experimenting. There's an inertia, that inertia of crossing the chasm, finding clans, and we tend to make what we sell. So we adapt very much what has been found to the needs of that client to be relevant and sell. And that's the whole crossing the chasm, going from the pioneers to the early adopters. And then becoming, moving and shifting into the product where we start selling what we make. We start standardizing, and from the experiences of different clients, we start standardizing what the product is and making it repeatable, having some formula that clients will want. And here becomes the go-to market and the marketing elements. So we want people to understand the product and see how it can solve their problem without having to make something totally custom for them. And of course, on maps and from a view of maps, people can try and jump in and by scanning weak signals, and that can be a fast follower. But of course, sometimes developing new technology using new paradigms is difficult to be a follower, and your experience comes from the experimentation. So you may jump into the points, but you need to be extremely adaptable as a business, and sometimes get people from the previous business and so on inside your organization to gain their experience. And of course, then you have the becoming more sort of a platform, a utility, a service that is kind of taken for granted, that is widely spread, that is scaled. And the inertia here is managing to go from a repeatable product to something that can scale. And that's also a challenge. Now, that's the normal evolution. That's when we ride that curve of adoption to the top level and become and staying basically the incumbent or the apex incumbent into the market is going through all those phases of being able to beat the inertia, the crossing the chasm, then the going to market, and finally the scaling. But in parallel to that, those new curves will come to the left. And if we think about those phases, we got what's called the phase of wonder. So how would the papers talk about it? They think of the Genesis as being this wonderful thing. And right now, a lot of the talk around AI is this wonderful thing that's going to change everything. Not so wonderful things from other perspective, but it sounds a bit magical how it's going to change everything. Then we got that phase of peace and the language, I think might have changed recently, but that's the whole language but it's kind of a good image, although it's not too pleasant to think about those things these days. But the idea of peace is that the market, everybody in the market actually makes good business. They make good margins, they sell, they have some potential for differentiation and innovation, and there isn't a high competition necessarily. People have an identity and people buy it. And then there's that phase of war, or so-called war, commercial war, essentially, where people would compete very much on price, and it is about market share at that point. It is about beating competition. And of course, it intensifies. And sometimes, some people may choose to actually go into that and scale and have tighter margins and so on, and more repeatability, higher volumes. And some others might look to actually move on to new innovation. So the ideas of, as something settle to the right of a map, how do new things emerge to the left of a map? So what does that enable? What's the next thing? And that's a new diffusion. How can we redefine that market with, let's say, a smartphone, where it was all about phone communication, it becomes a smartphone. So how do we create that new need? How we explore that new need and experiment to be on the next curve, not necessarily sticking to the existing one. And that's those adjacent moves. How can we get on those new curves as an adjacent move? So that's very much the topic of today. So looking at those adjacent possible, if we think about a typical product view of a product owner, you would have a product based on some components and subcomponents and some utilities underneath. And that's your value chains making up a product. And that's a product as a physical product. It's also a product as a service. In the service industry, tech industry, finance industry, you can imagine services being products, and now they're made of a number of components and subcomponents. Now, the typical thing in Agile for product owners is we look at iterating on those components, making them better. So iterative development. And we look also at creating new features sometimes that will complement the product, fundamentally to generate more transactions. And when you have this product focus, you kind of stay in that product. It's very difficult to innovate outside of the product. You can just make this thing better. So if we took an example, let's say of McDonald's, I guess everybody knows McDonald's or has consumed McDonald's. You want a burger meal. You're going to have a burger that is made of patties, cheese, and buns. And it's very summarized as the value chain. You may want a drink with it, and that may rely on milkshake machines, and then it relies on cooking or supply and storage underneath, and the restaurant estate as well. So looking at this, an innovation in terms of product innovation would be to create a new taste or a new assemblage of patties, cheese, and buns to create, let's say, what I think out there is a Philly stack, or I've seen the Big Tasty as well in the past. So you have a new sort of combination of things offering a slightly new product. And that's very much the four P's of marketing, where you're going to have that new assemblage being a new product. You're going to have a price and decide a price. Is it perceived higher up and it's going to be a bit more expensive, or are we trying to make a promotion and reduce its price to attract transactions? And of course, there will be a place, if it's McDonald's, it's kind of in their restaurants, but you can imagine with the home delivery and so on, how it expands now. So this view of a product very much keeps you into the four P's of marketing of product, price, place, and promotions. And what you're fundamentally trying to do is make more transactions with that. You're not fundamentally innovating the business. So if we think about that, typically businesses, in that sort, will focus on continuous improvement. So how do we maintain or up the quality? How do we control the cost without compromising quality? How do we improve lead time, which are the customer first criteria of Toyota? So quality, cost, lead time is very much what gets focus. And of course, the product, price, place, promotions from the marketing. And all this is relatively simple and hold in terms of management sort of principles. But on the map, you have to question what's happening in this empty space. And how do we expand in that? Because that's where the innovation starts. And unless you play in that dimension, you are exposed to some other players defining something new, an adjacent move that may make your business irrelevant. So a question to you is, how do we get to that? And maybe what McDonald's could do, start thinking about it. So how do we get to explore the side of the business? And the danger is when the view is business centric, is we think about the services the business has, the products the service the business has, to actually how do we flog them, for lack of a better word, to the customers through the four P's of marketing, and businesses find themselves very much stuck at that. And it's helpful to start thinking about a customer-centric view of the world, and that echoes very much about the old view that the Earth was at the center of the world and the sun was rotating around it, and the shift of heliocentricity to thinking the customer is the center of the business. It's putting the customer at the center and understanding how the business is one of the businesses that the customer can get to. And therefore, you need to understand their needs and you need to probe those to have a different perspective. So if we look on the map, effectively, we're lifting from the product view to the customer view. And suddenly we open the possibility that some customers may be different, and you may have different B2C customers. You may also have B2B customers. And in the case of our working example here, McDonald's, they will certainly have the guests, the people that come to their restaurant, but there may be different type of demographics with different needs. And there may be also a consideration for the B2B, the people that are looking to open a franchise with them and run a business with them. It's a choice they're making too. So they're also customers. And it's useful to start looking at the map, not just from a product perspective, but from a customer perspective, because that opens horizons. You can look at new ideas, new needs, and it's important to have this concept again from Dave Snowden around our new need. You may need to rely on a new component, but ideally that component should rely on the rest of the value chains of the business, because it's much easier to create innovation when you don't have to reinvent everything. So in that case, how can you leverage the existing value chains of the business with very few new things to actually address a new need? And that's what you call exaptation. So how do we recombine the lower parts of the value chain into something potentially new without changing so much? And how can we radically repurpose the business offering with that? And the map gives you some of that clarity. So, question to you, what do you think McDonald's could do to play more on the left side, play more with change of paradigms, how you get to consume basically a burger, fast food? What could be done? Any ideas? And I invite you to talk about it on audio. I purposefully took an example here that everybody should have some sense of consuming this product.
There's like an inherent tension, specifically for a company like McDonald's. There's an inherent tension between the systems that they've set up to be incredibly efficient and the innovation. So in terms of, as you mentioned, kind of your example of recombining things, I forget what it was called, the Philly stack or whatever it was, the kind of new type of burger. Yeah, that's kind of changing things up, but it's not very innovative. I guess there might be something in the other things that they do, like delivery or other kind of parts. I mean, like the Dell example of their primary business is making computers, but what they realized was that actually they could be just in time. And so that was their innovation. I don't know if I'm being coherent, but that makes sense. So there might be something in there, and Amazon's a good example, I suppose. That's following on from that thought, where their primary business is selling things to people, but actually they realized that they could develop their tech stack and then start selling that to other people. So there might be something that we're not seeing in the McDonald's setup that they could start to innovate around and actually diversify their organization to start to provide not necessarily burger related, but other things that you have to do really, really, really well to make burgers. But they could do that really well for other people. I mean, Amazon's another good example because they don't just provide their own deliveries; they also provide deliveries to other companies because they do a really good job of delivery. I'm not an Amazon delivery driver, so I don't know how that feels. But
they started with books.
True, yeah,
And
exactly.
they opened up with a lot of other things, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know what they could do, but I think there's probably something that we're not seeing in their stack of services that they need to provide to be efficient and to run an organization really well. That I mean, it could be something as stupid, not stupid, but it could be something as simple as managing. Oh God, what's the word? Like not federated. It's not franchises. They do that well, right? Because I mean, what's interesting about McDonald's? Sorry, I'm riffing here. But what's interesting about McDonald's is it's a combination of lots of different companies, and it's like effectively, I think it's effectively that companies like Coca-Cola needed an avenue to sell their product. So you put together a company like McDonald's that sells that product. So yeah, McDonald's is an interesting one. If you start picking it apart, you realize there's actually lots of things that have to come together in order for that to be successful. And you could start to innovate with those things.
Thank you. Thank you. And I tried a little to think about it earlier, and just to distinguish between what may be the marginal iterative innovation like the Philly stack, which is actually exapting from patties, cheese, and buns, to thinking when we think about the customer, what else may they be buying? So would they buy merchandising? Could you have cool merchandising? Maybe. Would they pay for a subscription service? Would they have a VIP club? A bit like Prime does at Amazon. Would they have sort of occasion-based services like parties or corporate lunch? Could they have food trucks on, the Glastonburies and the festivals and sport events and stuff like that? And those are very much, an extension, quite a substantial innovation compared to a new type of burger. But nonetheless, they all plugged into the existing value chains. And then you can look at things that are a lot more distant, like should they be in video games? Maybe the gamers like having a McDonald's. I mean, what does that mean? Is there a connection here? Does that connect somewhere in their value chains or not? Real estate, McDonald's is known for having a real estate and being also a real estate company around their sites. Could they do more with that? So all those things are opening in that left-hand side. And it's to understand as a business, are you challenge yourself beyond the standard, what you know, beyond your standard go-to-market with the 4 Ps? Are you start connecting a wider experience with the elements you have to exapt and do some radical new offers from that? So that's the idea of how within a company you start looking at how do I challenge myself to continually explore adjacent moves. And it's really looking at the empty space. Generally, a company very commoditized in a way will see the value chains very much to the right. And then it's looking, how do we create something to the left? But something that as far as possible can connect into the value chain so it doesn't become something completely unsurmountable to put together. And the iterative approach to that will actually create the innovation where the company will continuously challenge into its market and renew itself and potentially rides multiple curves, not stay stuck and exposed on one curve of diffusion. So that's the idea, looking at it from the company side. Now we're going to look at it more at an industry level and seeing how do we see the disruption materializing. So last time we talked about Betamax and associating basically the product and the content and a big lessons learned from Sony at that time. And we talked about the 4 Ps of marketing, and which I mentioned earlier as well in the working example here, and how this is still very much prevalent in many organizations. Driving the strategy in many organizations is still very inspired by the 4 Ps. About that's the product we have, and we figure how we go to market, where do we position them, what promotions we do, at what price we sell. And that's getting challenged by digital, in terms of the product being, mix of content, belonging to an ecosystem, having a service and so on. The price being bundled, aggregators challenging the price, being able to personalize the promotions. How do you create relationship at scale so you don't erode your margins so much? How do you create targeted and highly tailored things so that there is a value add in it? And the place, how do you go from, there was a place of consumption to now being the doorstep potentially and having access at your doorstep, to global offerings that notably Amazon can bring to your doorstep very often. So all those four Ps are very, very challenged. And I was starting to position that with the Betamax product and content were very much linked together. But today we can look at more the service element and starting on the platform. And all this is held by tech very much. And not that the four Ps disappear, they still matter. But the new mix is also very important of the product, service, content, and platform held by tech together. And if we take the example of the Walkman, in the 90s, Sony was very dominant on that. And I don't know if many people here are from the Walkman age, but I had a few. And at the time, the trick was to make a small Walkman, almost barely any bigger than the cassette it was playing, and looking at what were the next technologies. And of course, Sony, was at the back of the challenge of the Betamax and the Walkman. They were the absolute dominant player in the Walkman, but they were starting to be challenged on the one hand by the technology with the emerging new format, the CD and so on, but also being challenged by the Walkman curve itself, having new entrants on the market that were able to produce pretty much equal quality, equal size, equal technology. It was there long enough that they could now match Sony production capability and innovation capability. So if we look at it through a map, what a Walkman customer wants, probably audio quality, some interoperability, some portability, of course, and being able to play their favorite mix of music, which they will tend to recall on a cassette. So looking at how does that play lower down the value chains is the audio quality. You had the home hi-fi systems, the vinyls, the cassettes, and the cassette allowed to record a tape mix, and the very romantic thing as well to do a mixtape to your girlfriend or boyfriend at the time. And then looking at what underpinned that underneath was music megastores, publisher, distributors with the licensing, some labels, and the artist. And then, what was the differentiation is the portability, the quality of the Walkman, so the quality of its music, whether it was small enough as well. And to a degree, the interoperability was important. So you can actually use the cassette in your car as well. And then came the CD, which was very much at the start a home hi-fi things and allowed to renew the collections of vinyl with a higher quality, which kept the music megastores very much in business. And then looking at the portability of that with the Discman, which had challenges of stabilizing the cell that would read the CD when you were going about, that would be jumping sometimes and it wasn't working so well. So for portability, the play stabilization was important, and that wasn't the forte of the Discman. And then looking at our mini disc player, so that was a new format Sony was launching, which was aiming to offer a better portability with the play stabilization, as well as having the quality of the CD, but the possibility also to record. And that was something Sony was very much looking to push as a new format. Very much as, and how far do you place that new technology in the iterative cycle? It was very much a different type of cassette at the end of the day. But fundamentally following the same format. And at the same time, there were computers and MP3, MP3s were basically tended to rip the music with peer-to-peer exchange and the ability to have a playlist. But of course, the computer wasn't very portable. And at the time, MP3 was probably seen as a danger to the industry because people hacking and basically ripping the music and not necessarily having the DRM to enable to enforce the licensing law. So here we have quite a complicated map suddenly. And we're just going to clean it up a bit before we look at the map a bit more. So those elements like interoperability, it's a factor in the inertia of changing standards, and it's an important element. But for the map, maybe not so relevant. Nor does is car stereo. And the home hi-fi system and the vinyls probably not so relevant either. In the whole industry they are, but for this map particularly, maybe not so much. So we remove them. And then looking at also consolidate view. So there's a concept of pipelines in maps, and that's a mapping education here, which allow to consolidate a number of versions of the same thing into what you call a pipeline, and you position it based on their maturity. So if we apply a pipeline to the device, mini disc player, Discman, and Walkman, we can see at one end of the spectrum something that has been around for a while, and at the other end of the spectrum something that is very new. And if we do the same with the mediums, so mediums being used as a mini disc, a CD, or a cassette, very much we see a pairing between the two, the device and its medium. And that was the whole reason for fighting standards at the time. And so that tight coupling basically between those. And the play stabilization was a big deal back then. Now we don't even think about it, but when you were listening to your music and it was breaking all the time, that was a problem for portability. So a lot of effort was actually spent trying to stabilize the play. And of course, it's interesting to see how the whole industry relied on well-established lower value chains, which were all very ordered, the licensing and so on, that was all very, very organized. And as in an industry, there was certainly an inertia to think about something different, and something different would potentially upset the licensing, which was a problem. Then looking at the new entrants, and those new formats emerged, and it's interesting that it wasn't necessarily as intentional in terms of somebody owning the format. The format emerged from digitalization capabilities, and the device happened to be the computer at the time. And then looking at the inertia of moving and the adoption of this, miniaturizing the computer was essential. In order for the format to gain scale, it needed to be smaller and be transportable effectively. And looking underneath, the industry also needed to rethink its very established way of managing licensing, so that it will control the copyrights and the artist could carry on existing, but also an industry could carry on making money. And the playlist created probably some service opportunities, and the idea of gifting playlists and libraries and backing up things and so on. Suddenly there would be quite a lot of services that could be derived from that. So at that time, and with the benefit of hindsight, what could Sony have done? And if we look at the different parts, So the different places in different place, and on maps you look at those things. And I'm going to do a quick poll for those that are listening. So you should see the poll launching. If you were Sony in the 90s, what would you have done? Would you have pushed the Discman, the CDs and Discman, and the stabilization, essentially, to make it a relevant offering? Would you have developed the mini disc as a new format? Or let me just get that. The mini disc as a new format with the ability to record more portability and more stable play. Would you have invested to miniaturize computing and effective storage mechanism to actually play it? Would you have invested in the virtual distribution of audio content? Or in the DRM, digital rights management, to enable copyright in the digital age? Or would you have invested in labels and artists to control distribution of content at source? Or in digital services such as playlists, libraries, backup, etc. So that's the poll. It is out. So if you can try and vote quickly, and we look what you're thinking. So I'll leave that here. So let's leave it 30 seconds or so. And you can select multiple places of investment. And you can see whilst you're voting on a map, you can really say where are we making this investment and why. It is very visual. So let's end the poll and see what you think. So share the results. So miniaturize computing, invest in virtual distribution of audio content, DRM, label an artist, and that's it. So what did Sony did? Do people know? And a very interesting thing is they did invest in labels and so on. You know, Sony Music is probably bigger than Sony Electronics now, and Sony Pictures as well is bigger. And that's a direct inheritance of the Betamax time when, you know, they lost the war. I mean, the challenge of Betamax and the dominance of the market of Betamax, and they really thought it was because they couldn't bring enough content on that format. And since then they bought, and at that time they bought music studios and film studios, which to this day are probably now bigger than the electronic division. So they very much went on that. I remember owning as well a device. So the invest in miniaturization. I remember owning a new Walkman that was a flash memory. So there was no hard drive for the stabilization, but it could only hold about 15 songs. So as a product, it was very advanced, but the technology didn't allow to make it very practical. So what happened then, and you all know what happened, all this space was the iPod. And iPod promised to bring 1,000 songs in your pocket, use the format, made it DRM compatible, and actually sorted out the stabilization. And the idea of stabilization, they had a really specific hard drive that allowed that. And I think the story goes that Steve Jobs personally placed an order of hard drive when they found the manufacturers that could do that, which enabled the iPod. And he placed such a big order that the manufacturers couldn't actually supply the competition at that time. So that he secured basically not only the enabling part of its iPod, but it also prevented the competition to be able to bring that. So very much the idea here, what we have is a new offering that is left field. It's no longer a cassette. It's basically the computer skills that enable the hardware and the software to replace the mechanical analog, even with digital technologies, but or digital music on the CDs or the mini disc, but relatively a device that was analog. And when we look at how the iPod came to be, it replaced that whole ecosystem of the devices that existed. And Sony, as the curve of Sony being, the Walkman apex incumbent, got displaced, and all the people in the Walkman industry very much got displaced. Also, what's interesting is the lower value chains got also challenged, because you don't really see the big music media store now. They are more like relics of vinyls and so on, specialist shops now. Those mega stores, they're no longer as big as they used to be. And it's where the iPod not only was the innovation of the device and as an adjacent move for Apple from computers to those devices, and a move that Sony couldn't make. Basically, it replaced the whole market and took over the whole market. But it also replaced the supply, the lower level value chains to that market, supplying basically the content. And I go back on this view of the iPod being the product, iTunes being the service, and the content as licensed music and enabled by tech with the hard drive. And in the future, the platform that has developed is Apple Music since then. So very much that new concept of digital mix, product, service, content platform, and the iPod bringing the product, content, and service together, enabled by tech. So that's about it for today. I hope that opens some thoughts, and we are just about on time. But if you have any parting thoughts or ideas that this brought, please feel free to share before leaving the call. Thank you very much.